Hi everybody, and welcome to Module 4 of Research 1, Psych 205. We will be discussing non-experimental methods this time. We have quite a few methods, so let's go ahead and get started. First of all, there are two different kinds of methods generally, or more broadly. There's quantitative and qualitative studies. Quantitative studies tend to be preferred by psychologists because we have a bias that they tend to be less, ironically, less biased in the interpretation because they are numerical, and we aren't putting our interpretation on those really at all. Whereas qualitative studies, like the study of a culture or interview answers or type of clothing that someone wears, those types of analyses take a lot more intuitive insight, and we feel like bias can kind of sneak in there. The focus with qualitative is on themes, and so you get a lot of rich data that way compared to the more experimental quantitative psychology type methods that we use. Psychologists do both, but we're going to focus on the quantitative because that's primarily what psychologists do. So non-experimental methods, the purpose of them is to describe phenomena compared to experiments, which are intended to identify cause-effect relationships. The cause-effect relationships help us explain, well, why did this variable change? Well, because this one made it change. And so as opposed to just describing, it actually explains, which is very, very helpful. Okay, so here are the types of non-experimental methods that are most commonly used by psychologists. This is not all, but these are the most common. First of all, we've spoken about this before, correlational methods, and in this case I mean the kind that we've discussed already with the scatter plots and the two variables and the positive and negative relationship, the strength and direction, all those things. The relationship between existing variables, that's what I mean by correlational studies, like a Pearson R that I wrote down with between 0 and 1, positive or negative. That's what I'm talking about here. That's one thing that we do a lot of. Self-esteem and depression, texting and infidelity, whatever it is, two variables that are already out there. We're not manipulating anything, we're just measuring them. Ex post facto studies are actually a type of correlational study in the sense that there is no causality. They are not causal, although they may appear that way, because what happens with ex post facto is we are comparing pre-existing groups of people. So we take a variable of interest, say race or gender or religion or lots of things already exist. Divorce versus intact families, whatever, marital status, all those things are either already existing, like gender, or they are chosen or selected by the participants, like divorce, for example. So we can't manipulate those things. We can't randomly assign someone to the smoking condition or to the divorce condition. So instead, we compare smokers versus non-smokers, or African Americans and Caucasians, or men and women. We compare those groups, and because we're studying these pre-existing groups, well, we can find some very interesting relationships. We can't infer causality, again, because of that third variable problem. We don't really know, what else might be influencing that relationship. So, for example, if we're looking at perceptions of satisfaction in relationships between men and women, gender would be our grouping variable, our variable that we are looking at in terms of groups, and the variable that we're looking for differences in between those groups would be satisfaction. And so we might find some differences, but we can't say that gender caused those differences. But it's still interesting and important to do that. Compare that to two existing variables that you're looking for the relationship between. Here we're looking for differences typically, but still a relationship. Longitudinal studies, longitudinal studies are those that take place over time. It can be anywhere from like a week to decades. There's a twin study that's been going on. I think the Minnesota twin study has been going on for like 5 decades or something. They follow the same pairs of twins. Well, most of them. A lot of them have died or dropped out over 50 years to study how twins who have either been adopted out or grown up together, how their behavior and personalities, etc., are influenced by being twins. The longitudinal studies are really the only way to measure change. So if you want to try to remember that easily, think longitudinal is long. Even if it's only a week, it's a long period of time. Compare that to a cross-sectional study where we're still interested in looking at differences in time periods or age. So for example, if we were interested in memory of younger versus older adults with longitudinal study, we would follow them over time and keep testing them over and over again on that same memory measure. But with cross-sectional study, that same day we might take a group of 20-year-olds and test them on the memory measure, and take a group of 70-year-olds and test them on that memory measure and compare those. Now the big problem with that, hopefully you see, is that we have what's called a cohort effect. The 70-year-olds grew up in a very different situation than the 20-year-olds. Lots and lots of different things are going on now. I know that my memory has gotten worse actually since smartphones, and these younger generations, they don't know each other's phone numbers. They only have them in in their phone books by name, so they don't remember maybe as much. So there are different things about the cohort in which you grew up that might actually explain the change, the difference. And so you really have to follow those same people over time to get that that change that you're looking for. These you usually lose a lot of people over time for dropping out or whatever, moving away, and they are very, very time consuming and difficult to carry out and have some other problems as well. But in general, it's really the only way you can measure real change. Okay. So the next one is naturalistic observation. And naturalistic observation is essentially unobtrusively or unbeknownst to the people you are watching, observing behavior that occurs in the natural world. So in a natural setting, like kids at a playground being aggressive or choosing, different kinds of games to play, watching internet connectivity device use with couples at a restaurant, something like that. You're watching what's just naturally happening. And so you are not manipulating anything, you are simply watching what is happening. And we're going to spend a little bit more time in a separate module talking about this because it is quite complicated. There are several different kinds of observation that you can do. One of the most important things with observation is to operationally define your variables. And it's because when you go out there and you're observing, you want to know exactly what behaviors count as what. So for example, if there's a student who's doing a study on parent-child interactions during those children's sporting events, you have to really define, operationally, something like controlling, for example. What behaviors and facial expressions and movements and all those things count as controlling? And you have to abide by those. If you see something else that you think counts as controlling and you haven't defined it in your operational definition, you can't count it because that's cheating. Also, ideally, you are blind to the hypothesis, so you'd have somebody else go out and do the observation for you. It can't always happen that way, but clearly your own awareness of what you're looking for may influence your recording of the data or your interpretation of what you're seeing. So we'll talk about that more later. There are also surveys. You guys have probably filled out lots and lots of these over your lifespan. Even tests that you've taken in elementary school to a certain extent are kind of survey, especially with multiple choice answers. Surveys can be extremely useful. They are very, very convenient to give out to people, but they are extremely difficult to make. And it doesn't seem like they would be very difficult to make. It seems like an easy way to do a study, but in fact it's very complex, and we're also going to spend another whole module, or another whole lecture talking just about survey creation, because there are lots of things to consider when you're making a survey. And again, all these are typically correlational. Although you can manipulate things in your survey and that technically make it experimental. But as I said, generally that's correlational and therefore non-experimental. A meta-analysis, just briefly, it's a study of studies. It's where the studies themselves are the participants. So you go out and find a bunch of studies that meet a specific criteria, say about mate selection or what people want in a long-term relationship partner. And you find, say, 100 studies. And then you analyze their findings to see generally if they are similar across the different studies or if they have changed over time. So it's basically an analysis of studies that already exist. It can be kind of neat. Those are fun to read because they really not only give you like a review article overview of what you're reading, but they actually give you statistics, and it's almost like an empirical article based on review of the literature. So those are interesting, but they're also complicated, not really undergraduate level work. And then archival, finally, this is pre-existing data use. So maybe you could borrow a data set that I have, that I collected data last year, and while I was answering one question, you might have a very different question, but my data works for that, so you can use that. That's a perfectly legitimate way to do a study, and it's archival because the data already exists. Or you could have something like, you know, online dating sites. You could analyze the frequencies of use or the satisfaction levels or the attractiveness of the people, all those different things using, you know, different kinds of scales for that. Or you could look at sports statistics and injuries and temperature, so you could do correlational study looking at were there more violent interchanges on the field of whatever sport when it was hotter outside, and they have found actually yes, there are heat and aggression are correlated, and it's interesting to look at that in sports. So you could easily do that as an archival study. So these all have strengths and limitations. Again, this is very inconvenient. This is not necessarily so accurate. This, we can't see causality, nor this one. Survey, same thing. It's correlational typically. The meta-analysis, a very good overview, but it's not really showing anything new except what, you know, what the summary of the literature is to date. And then archival, if you can't find the right data set, or if you have to use proxy variables, like this is kind of what I'm looking for, it's not exactly right, but it works. I'm looking for the age of the youngest driver in the family, but I'll just take the number of, you know, the age of the person who is driving most in the family, for example. So you might have to settle for variables that aren't exactly what you want. And also, you really can't look at causality. Even if the experiment was run for some other purpose, you can't just do the same analyses over again. Your questions might not be answerable in a way that you can look at causality. So, as you can see, the bias is towards experiments. These are all excellent methods, lots of fun. We're going to do lots of activities to help you get acquainted with them, but this is an overview of all the different kinds of non-experimental methods that psychologists use for the most part. Again, like I said, there are some others, but these are the primary ones. All right, guys, I'll see you when I talk to you about observation and surveys.